Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
proporre con la propria vita
esiste anche grazie a te.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting entitled the Sick Capitalism. Allow me to give you a preliminary remark, and then I would like to leave the floor to my guests. Every day, there are respectable companies managed by good people who make decisions whose consequences are very serious, if not disastrous, for society. There's a famous company, well-renowned company, that actually designed chips packaged in a tube, which create addiction. Then there's another chemical company that produced a toxic substance that entered the bloodstream of 99% of the Americans. And then that company later on tried to do what it could, everything it could, to kind of hide this fact. There's yet another aeronautical company, very important, that put pressure on the US Congress so that it assigned the checks on plane security to the company itself. And this had really tragic and tragically immeasurable companies. In the name of maximization of profits, lots of companies in the sector of energy are financing think tanks and research activities promoting pseudoscientific activities to the public. And plus, there's another chapter I wouldn't like to delve too much into that refers to technological conglomerates that conditioned our lives with products we will never be able to do without, who, however, have potential negative effects, and we're measuring this now, not only on our cognitive abilities, but also on the quality of social relationships. So there's not only an issue of what certain things do to our brain, but also what certain things do to our ability to relate to the others. And I think I'm relating to something everybody knows. Now, the modern justification of capitalism is based on the idea that a system based on the market can transform the search for personal interest into socially desirable results, which in turn become profits. This idea, however, does not consider one fundamental thing, that is to say, the enormous, if not absolute, power that great corporations have, ranging from what we eat to what we drink, to what we read or not read. So big companies, often supported by regulatory authorities, influenced by the company itself, oftentimes end up significantly control our lives without us noticing. So this is the framework within which we are basically debating. That's a bit of a desert, and I hope that our guests will help us lay some bricks onto this desert. This is the framework and the premise we're starting from for this debate. And now I'll move on introducing to our guests. I'm very grateful to you all. In particular, I'm very grateful that Luigi Zingales who has traveled all over from the United States. He's professor of entrepreneurship and finance at the University of Chicago. And there he heads the Stiglitz Center. That's a very important center for the study of all the distortions of capitalism, and a center from which interesting reflections in the context of antitrust have been moved. He's the author of several publications. His world bestseller, I think it dates back to about 20 years ago, Saving Capitalism from Capitalists, written with Mr. Rambaggio. And he's the co-author of the podcast Capital Isn't. And this tells us a lot of his ability as a communicator, capable of communicating complex things in simple ways. Then, Emilio Colombo, professor of economic policy at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. And then, further to the left, Piergiovanna Natale, who teaches political economy at Università di Milano, Bicocca. This session is going to take place as follows. We asked Professor Zingales to kind of reproduce an academic format. Here we asked Professor Zingales to hold a short introductory lecture that can talk about the sicknesses deriving from capitalism, and Piergiovanna Natale and Emilio Colombo are going after that to make some reflections, to share with us some remarks, and then Professor Zingales will be able to answer their remarks. I would like to kindly ask you to make a big applause for our dear guests. So, Professor Zingales, you have the floor. So these are my slides. Perfect. This evening I'm going to talk about the research activity that I'm working on together with a colleague, Oliver Hart. 7 years ago, the Morandi Bridge collapsed in Genoa, killing 43 people. The really tragic thing is the fact that in this case the risk of the collapse was known. As a matter of fact, it had been discussed on the occasion of the board of directors of the company managing the highways in 2010, and in 2013 that risk had even been mentioned in the risk catalogue. And the biggest risk of the company was the risk of collapse due to delayed maintenance actions. So my question is, let's imagine that you sit in the board of directors. You are aware, you've been informed of this, but nobody makes any changes. So what would you have done? What were you supposed to do? So from which perspective? We would like to think that all perspectives may yield the same answer, but there are different prospects. First of all, there's a moral obligation, in other words, what you're supposed to do from a moral point of view. Then what's your responsibility with respect to shareholders? And then what's better for you from the point of view of your career prospects? From the moral point of view, of course, you're supposed to, do anything you can in order for some kind of action to take place, for maintenance to be done, or for the works to be done. From the point of view of profit maximization, the board members was probably the right thing to do, because at the end of the day, the Benetton family holding the company they even took profits from the collapse of the Morandi Bridge. So from the point of view of profits, they did the right thing. If you look at your career prospects, if you make confusion, if you make a lot of confusion, nobody will take care about you and nobody will appoint you as a board member. So the right thing from the point of view of a career prospect is to rather resign in silence. This kind of trade-off is not only an Italian problem. As Mattia reminded us before, there are lots of American companies who've made the same mistakes, ranging from Boeing, who built a plane that needed to have a special training for it to be flown, but actually pilots were not trained. People forgot about doing this training. When the first Boeing fell to the ground, nobody said, so the Boeing people didn't say anything. They basically blamed the Indonesian pilot who was incapable of actually flying a plane. And then they killed the second pilot, and then in the end, they admitted that something probably had to be done. Let us not forget that our dear German friends, I mean, when they do things great. So, for example, when they decided to cheat, they did this worldwide. They created a mechanism to fraud all the checks to avoid all anti-pollution checks. And so they had diesel cars circulating around that killed people. So over 1,000 people died due to these devices. Mattia was reminding us of DuPont. Actually, I like to tell the companies by their names. It's important to do this. So DuPont threw away, threw on the Ohio River, a huge quantity of a toxic substance that gets accumulated in our bloodstream. There's a wonderful film, Dark Waters. I suggest that you watch it. It's about that story. And then Exxon. Exxon is the company who, in 1979, had scientists explaining it what climate change was about. And then in 1981, they made forecasts. And if you project them by now, they were really perfect. They really had registered the temperature increase we had last year. However, since 1981, they started circulating rumors like, actually, we don't know, we're not sure, there's a confidence interval, and so on and so forth. So they basically funded uncertainty over climate change. I'm going to show you this video. This was taken from Greenpeace. Chapeau to Greenpeace. They interviewed an ex-lobbyist and asked him what he was doing. Let's listen to what he's saying. We fought aggressively against some of the science. Yes. Did we hurt our science? Absolutely not. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. Either we were looking out to protect our investments, we were looking out for our shareholders. This is very important. There's nothing illegal about that. And this makes things more problematic. If it were illegal, it would be easy to block them, or at least easier. Now it's very, very difficult. In this way, it's very difficult. So what's the definition of a sociopathic? A sociopath, is an individual, or actually of somebody who's capable of doing anything. So lying, manipulating, violating social norms to pursue his own interests. These companies, appear to be sociopathic. The impressive thing is that these choices are not made by evil people. As Mattia reminded us before, the lobbyist or the boss of Exxon are not bad people. They're not evil people. They are decent people who are, in a way, induced by companies, but they're companies to behave in a way that is detrimental for our society. And we call that the banality of evil. And how does this happen? I'll try and simplify as much as possible. And I give you two main concepts. First, it's got a bad name. It's called what I call the disinclusion of companies. That's much more important for American companies and for U.S. companies. And at the moment, I'm dealing with the fact that the economic theory that everybody is relying upon is wrong. So disinclusion means that once companies were rooted in society, so the plants were all concentrated. So Caterpillar that does lots of plants for earth handling, for all the plants were in Illinois. Workers were there. Shareholders were part of the community. They were there. The executives and the board members would live in the area. They would get to mass with their employees. And when there was something wrong, probably they were even socially reproached by the people living together with them. So it was easier. That was not an ideal word. I'm not saying this. There were lots of problems. However, it was easier to internalize the externalities. In other words, it was easier for these people to behave as sociopaths, because actually they would pay the consequences of their behavior, either legally or economically. Today, instead, the world is globalized. Plants are scattered all over the world. Workers, investors, board members are all over the world. The few executives who live close to the plants are oftentimes the headquarters are not even close to the factories. When they are, the executives live in communities and they do not even meet the employees. So in this world, it's very, very difficult to exercise social pressure. And it's much easier, this is much easier if you are, let's say, a Japanese fund investing in a US company. It's difficult to kind of be worried, to get concerned about the kind of pollution that that company will produce in an unknown place in Illinois. This has facilitated for certain people to behave in a way that is not decent at all. The second thing is the fact that there is a wrong economic theory. In 1970, Friedman wrote an article on the New York Times that was very influential, and he said, and I quote, "In a system of free enterprise, an executive is basically an employee of the company, and he's got direct responsibility towards his employers. This responsibility consists in carrying out the activity in line with their wishes, which generally will consist in making as much money as possible." Now, Friedman perfectly knows that most people are not so bad that they think only about money. But he came out with this very smart idea. He said basically, well, I know that Mattia is a good people. He cares about society. He cares about the company. But he can do that as an individual, or he can do that as a shareholder or as the boss of a company. So I'm telling him, do this as an individual, because what matters is that you as a company, that you maximize profits and that you then redistribute them, and then individually you can do whatever you want. In this way, you will have more money to distribute and you will make more good to everybody. So this separation between the economic aspect and the social aspect has become a real faith, a fundamental faith for the management of most patrimonies in the world. If you manage, let's say, the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has a capital of $75 billion. And how will you manage that money? Friedman basically says, okay, the Gates Foundation has as a social objective that of helping, let's say, the whole world, wealth, healthcare all over the world, etc. But when you invest your money, you can ignore all of that, because the only thing you need to do is to maximize the returns of your investments. Then you take that money, you give this money to those who distribute the money, and you can distribute more. So don't worry about what you're doing. Do maximize the returns, and then you will distribute that. From this viewpoint, I mean, the idea might sound marvelous. The world would be extremely simplified. But unfortunately, if you take the idea seriously, there will be nobody looking at the sociopathic behavior. If you maximize profits only, then you will ignore the conditions. In other words, you might be tempted to say, okay, we kill people, but we can maximize money, and then in the end, at the end of the day, everybody will be better. Based on this approach facilitated the development of certain objectives. If a company may have multiple objectives, you won't want to pay everything based on profits. Otherwise, all the other objectives will be ignored. But if you believe in Friedman's theory and in the fact that he tells you that you have to make the largest amount of money possible, well then, okay, I give very high incentives to the management so that they maximize profits. So the result of this was that over the last 30 years, we've had a huge increase in the percentage of the compensation of the most important executives based on a company performance. In the 1950s or 60s, it was 100%. Now it's even 80%. Clearly, if you tell somebody 80% that 80% of the compensation depends on the amount of money he produces, of course he will do anything he can to do that. And so we end up in a very problematic situation. How can we solve this problem? We live in a world where we sort of built companies that are so much directed, so much targeted to maximizing their profits that they have lost their interest in us. If you've probably watched 2001 Odyssey in Space, Space Odyssey, there's a wonderful image of a computer telling the astronaut, my mission is too important for you to destroy it. And so the result is that I have to kill you. The computer is a machine created by man. But at a given stage, it becomes so important and so relevant that it actually that it acts beyond and above human lives. And that's the world we live in. How can we solve these issues? We can do it by understanding where Friedman made a mistake. The mistake he made was on a very simple aspect. In other words, the assumption that is not true, that economic decisions and moral decisions are separate. They rarely are when you do a donation, when you make a donation. If you do a donation as an individual or as a company, it's the same thing. It's the same donation. But in many cases in the world, that dramatically changes because it's much less expensive not to pollute than to pollute and then pay to clean afterwards. Let alone when you talk about the loss of human lives. So you can say, okay, I'll maximize profits, then I actually have the bridge collapse, and then I will have these people resuscitate. But we're not Jesus Christ. It doesn't happen. So that's a serious issue. Another example, a real one. Pfizer and Moderna came out with a wonderful vaccine against COVID-19, and then at the given stage, they were asked to give it for free in Africa. This is much more than actually taking all the profits and using the profits to buy vaccines and distributing them to the Africans. And why? Because if you know a bit about economy, the inefficiency of monopolies provides for the fact that if you take extra profits and you give them for free to the Africans, they will never buy enough vaccines. So it's better to give the vaccines to them for free. Many shareholders were in favor, others voted against, and the result was that they did not share the vaccine. Oliver and I claim that the fundamental mistakes consists in thinking that the only objective that a company has to pursue is to maximize profits. Companies have to maximize the well-being of shareholders. Because the shareholders are the only one who pay in person. So if you decide not to sell weapons to Russia, then workers will nonetheless earn the same compensation. Investors and debentures will take the same interests, and only shareholders will lose. So there's a rule according to which actually if you pay the bill, then you choose the restaurant. And as actually the shareholders who pay the bill, they will choose the restaurant. Shareholders do not necessarily want to go to a restaurant where they can minimize the cost, but they want to have a restaurant where they can eat well. They might not want to spend a lot, but actually they want to have a good restaurant. And in particular, many shareholders are concerned by the impact that their companies have on our political system. Exxon manipulates public opinion and has an impact on the U.S. political system. And we, with our money and pensions invested in Exxon, we pay Exxon to manipulate us. This is absurd. So we pay Exxon to pollute the water we drink and the air we breathe. And plus, if you're not that selfish and if you have some kind of social solidarity, sense of solidarity, you might also be concerned by your impact on the world. Then, of course, it's nice to maximize the well-being of society, but how can this be done? Before I explain this to you, the sentence I like the most is actually that this is a small step for theory, but I hope this will be a huge step for mankind. So theoretically, it's something really trivial. It's nothing great. But if you think seriously about that, this means that somehow companies have to actually bring some moral issues back onto the tables of the board of directors. I sat there and ideas of morality have never been questioned, even if we knew that there were moral choices to make. The idea of just saying we don't have to maximize profits, but rather the well-being of shareholders means that we have to openly discuss moral decisions, and this is a huge step. And how can this be done from a practical point of view? The idea is that we need to understand, if you have a company made up of 3 to 5 people, that's easy. Just ask them what they want to do, and then based on what they say, I mean, you can weigh their wishes and basically then maximize that function. But when you have millions of shareholders, well, this gets quite complicated. In the States today, we're trying to do this in various ways. But the main problem is that most of us is not willing or doesn't have time to give this information to those who ask, who demand it. If you detain 10 shares by Exxon, you won't change the world. There's billions of shares, so 10 shares is nothing. All in all, they do not count that much. So you might say, okay, if I were to spend my time thinking what's the right thing to say to Exxon, and then nothing changes because I just own all 10 shares, well, I won't do it. And so the result is that if nobody does that, small, minor shareholders are not represented in the decisions made by the company. This idea of rational apathy has often been used by political experts when it comes to electoral choices. However, electoral choices are very much emotional. At least in Italy, we have 1 hour at school of civic education in which we are told that actually it is told to us that we have the right and the duty, the moral duty at least, to go and vote. But I've never heard that you have the duty to go and vote for your shares. And if you own investment funds, that's even more complicated. You would have to tell the funds how they were to vote on your behalf. All the solutions put forward today in the States have this problem in common. Most people are passive, and they do not express their wishes. but this actually makes up for a very large chunk of the population. And that's why we came out with this idea of borrowing an old idea that goes back to Athens and the Athenian democracy. That democracy was not based on elections, but rather on polls. Now, we know this because we know statistics, and actually with polls, you have a great advantage. You can represent very well the population. If you have a sample of, say, 100, 200 people, that sample will be, let's say, 50% men and 50% women. It will maybe distributed based on certain parameters, exactly as in an exact way, so as to reproduce the population without the need for electoral campaigns or need for financing. And the idea is to kind of pull out among the shareholders of investment funds, let's say 150 people, have them sit together in a room like this, pay them for their time, so that even poor people can, in a way, leave their work aside and participate in the meetings, and there give their guidelines and express their wish of how certain decisions should be made. It's very easy to be generous with other people's money. What we want is that shareholders are generous with their own money. This people is jeopardizing their money and represents all the others. And as they're chosen randomly, they are a very good representation of the population. Some of you might object that actually these decisions are left in the hands of, let's say, cleaning women. First of all, actually, all the people, or actually even cleaning women, cleaning ladies have nothing wrong. They vote like anybody else, and they have the right to be represented. And then second, we're not saying that we will give these people, let's say, to decide how to do brain surgery. This is a technical decision. Because of that technical decision, you have to hire an expert, the most competent and best person to do that. But if we're talking about moral decisions, so to say, for example, whether to keep a person alive or not, or whether you have to renounce part of your money for a given cause, these are choices that you cannot entrust to somebody else. No expert will know more than you, better than you what you want. Experts can help you understand what the trade-offs are, but ultimately, this is a political choice that has to be made in a democratic way for the shareholders. The very interesting thing as an economist for me is that this is the most efficient way for these resources to be managed by the owners of the shares. The way we're doing that now doesn't work. Real shareholders are not present, and in this way we can have them present without overwhelming them with lots of choices. Even if I started teaching civic education to all the young people, telling them that they have to go and vote, I mean, if you have a certain type of investment fund, you would have 500 companies in your portfolio. So can you think you can choose for all these people? That's impossible. You basically spend most of your time to choose the companies rather than working. So in this way, we can achieve the same outcome that we might achieve with having everybody informed, but at very tiny costs. So the advantage is enormous. So by way of conclusion, companies create lots of economic value, but their impact goes beyond this economic value. Traditionally, we've often thought that we could, in a way, maintain these externalities through regulation, taxation, social pressure. However, we live in a world where regulation is weak, and companies oftentimes oppose this regulation. Just have a look at Exxon. Then if we consider developing countries, oftentimes we're basically dealing with Western countries, the most developed ones, who manipulate the least educated people, the people who are the least capable of opposing this effect. So it's very, very difficult to think that that regulation can solve the problem in many African countries. And plus, in global companies, exercising pressure doesn't work. So the combination between shareholders, democracy, and regulation is better than regulation alone. So what am I trying to say here? The democracy created in a company is an improvement, won't actually solve all the problems. Actually, I cannot make any miracles. I do not have any faith, but I think that this can be an important, a significant step forward towards improving the current situation. Thank you very much.
Interrompo per un istante prima di dare la.
So before giving the floor to other speakers, I just wanted to tell you, if you haven't visited that, please go and see the exhibition on Amedeo and Peter Giannini entitled "You Cannot Die for a Dollar." And you will find there a different context, but the topics are very similar to what was said by Professor Zingales. They look at social impact and corporate democracy in a very similar way. So I will now shut up and I will give the floor to Professor Colombo. Thank you. And thank you for what you said. Luigi Zingales is very well known, very famous, and he can talk about things in a very simplified way and make them much easier than they actually are. I will make a couple of remarks following up to what you said at the beginning. The idea here usually applies to major corporations, and so everything is connected to the size of the company. From what you said, it seems to me that a medium or large company, which is not a corporation, has the ideal size because it is a company that is much more rooted in the local area and so has a relationship with the local community. Also, companies that are not that big are easier to regulate for a state, for a government. So if we compare U.S. data with the European data, Europe lacks bigger corporations, but also lacks medium and large companies. Comparing countries is never easy, but looking at the numbers and taking companies ranging from 50 to 250 employees, as in medium and large companies, in the United States they account for 5%. In Italy and Europe they account for 1% more or less. In Europe there are many small companies whose problem is to become big. And becoming big is quite important for companies because the adoption of new technologies requires a scale as well as access to markets, even in the European integrated market. So becoming big means becoming efficient. Finance helps companies to become efficient and to become big. Because another big difference between the U.S. and Europe is that in the U.S. finance can help small companies a lot to scale up to turn into major corporations. So to what extent can this approach be applied to companies that are not listed on the stock exchange? Or maybe different approaches can apply. For example, the German model, whereby there is the direct participation of workers in the management decisions of companies. And so maybe that model can be better applied to this context. What do you think about that? Clearly, my presentation was mostly focused on the United States, and as you rightly said, companies are much bigger there. Talking about Europe, let's focus on Italy, because if you talk about Sweden, Sweden has big companies. So this is an Italian, a Spanish, and a Greek problem. It is related to Southern Europe, which has some pluses and minuses. But you're perfectly right. The pluses are the fact that on different topics, there's much more social pressure than in the United States. I come from the Veneto region, and when there was a crisis in 2015-16, where many companies went bankrupt, many entrepreneurs committed suicide, and their life policy was used to pay their workers, which is totally inconceivable in many countries in the world. But in our region, in the Veneto region, company is basically family-run, are basically family-run. The pollution is not a topic where companies are much interested in. The PFOA, which is a chemical substance, does not only exist in Ohio, but also in Veneto, and polluted the aquifer there. In that case, there should be more transparency. It's not just a matter of workers. Volkswagen, for example, it is a company which is controlled by the German automotive trade union. Thanks to the co-determination system, half of the board members is appointed by the trade unions. And then Saxony, the Saxony state, owns another 5%, is in line with the trade unions, and appoint 15% out of the remaining 50% of board members. So they have the absolute majority. However, despite that, they did very badly in terms of pollution. They treated workers very well, but so well to the expense of the rest of the world, because they polluted everywhere systematically. I don't think that this is the only way forward. Small companies have an advantage, which is offset by the lack of economies of scale. As in, I don't think that in the future Italy cannot adapt to the new situation. This is a problem that we'll see in the future, and we're already seeing that in the transformation of the banking system. The banking system is a macroscopic world, and has always been so, but today it has rules that are only made in Frankfurt, not even in Italy. In Europe, there's always going to be the same system, which is going to be decided either in Frankfurt or in Brussels. So countries will not be able to keep their own identities. Professor Natale, the floor is yours. I also want to thank Professor Zingales for the very rich presentation and the very interesting topic. The title of this session is The Sicknesses of Capitalism, the Evils of Capitalism. Maybe the title could have been changed, as in, how can we shape the world through our individual choices as savers or investors. And I have some questions on how investors' assemblies work. they are just like citizens' assemblies. We know that citizens' assemblies were very successful because through them they talked about very difficult topics at specific times, and people that were far away in their positions could get closer, and so they're very interesting for that. Citizens' assemblies have played a very important role in specific times. As for shareholders' meetings, what do they do? As in, who decides the topics that the meeting has to focus on? Is it suggested by the board? Are they decided by the shareholder themselves? And I think it would be interesting to know that in order to understand the role of individual investors or shareholders. Then there's another question. Let's think about the problem of environmental pollution. So there are companies who have a different exposure to environmental pollution according to their activities. Will shareholders be sensitive the same way, regardless of the type of company? As in, there's going to be companies that will be most exposed to environmental risk, and others that will be less exposed due to their production activities. Those investing in a company with lower environmental risk, I think, is more sensitive to environmental consequences of production activities compared to those investing in companies with high environmental risk. So what would shareholders meeting do? Maybe there could be a situation where the self-government of the company, through a shareholders meeting, can impose restrictions on the behavior of the company. And or vice versa, since the shareholders meetings focuses on the preferences of shareholders, could decide to do something else. And let me make a final remark. Shareholders meeting make a difference between the self-government of companies and the management decided by regulations. Professor Zingales said that the combination between the two is the ideal solution. Where is the boundary between the two? Where do we expect the intervention of self-regulation in companies? And where should legislation intervene? Three wonderful questions. Thank you. Starting from the first one. How do shareholders' meetings work? I'm focusing on the U.S. once again, where now most people are no longer investing on individual companies, but in funds. Most of them, they are funds with a portfolio of 500 or 1,000 companies. Today, 3 funds, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, control about 25% of all the shares of the main American companies. So that's impressive. Not all this money is owned by small investors, but a significant part of it is owned by small investors. So the idea should not be to focus on individual shareholders' meetings, but on the shareholders' meetings of a fund, as in all those who invested in the fund are selected to make guidelines on how to vote in the shareholders' meetings of these companies. Today, BlackRock has experts deciding how to vote. And these experts only focus on profit maximization. But State Street is more democratic and votes in favor of democratic choices. Vanguard is more Republican and votes less in favor of democratic proposals. Why are they forgetting about profit maximization? In the end, they make political choices without being politically responsible. So our idea is to make these choices politically responsible. So let's start off with the funds, and then even minority shareholders could have their own companies, but that's at a later stage. In the United States, one is almost forced to invest in those companies because in the U.S. There's a small public pension, but the main pension for most people comes from a fund, an accumulation fund. And if you invest in American bonds, you're not retiring because returns are so low that you will never retire. So basically, they take money off your salary and they can decide where to put them, and they put this money where it is more profitable. So all Americans invest their money in the S&P 500, willy or nilly. So it's not that people are more sensitive to some companies and less to others. No. For people investing in S&P 500, they internalize effects also on other companies. Think about political lobbying. A lot of the money that is spent is to make lobbying one against the other. Investors are only losing their money in that, and therefore they have to spend less money for lobbying. And let's come to the last question. The first rule followed by the shareholders' meetings is to reduce the political impact of companies. In the United States, companies can finance all electoral campaigns, and therefore this is plutocracy. This is not democracy, but plutocracy. The weird thing is that through Supreme Court decisions and the First Amendment of the Constitution, the First Amendment of the American Constitution says that citizens have the right to do lobbying for their own interests. So the ability to limit the lobbying of American companies is not feasible for regulations, but shareholders can tell companies not to do lobbying. It is their right. So in the United States, this is the only way to limit the power of companies. The other possible way is to change the constitutions, but that will be probably in the distant future. I will not survive to see changes in that terms. But I would like to see some change, at least for my children. In the United States, this is the only possible way. In Europe, things are a bit better. There's more regulation. So if regulation is done well and in the proper way, then everything is okay. Companies don't need to have further constraints. But the advantage of this mechanism is to talk about problems. I studied DuPont. In 1984, DuPont, the company, perfectly knew that the PFOE was killing people. in the United States, APA didn't know about the PFOE. So they couldn't regulate what they do not know. The APA is the agency, the environmental agency. They didn't know about it. They didn't know what it was. And the main lawyers discovered about that in the early 2000s. So many people were killed and polluted. The problem is that companies have a lot of information. We all know that tobacco companies could not only sell tobacco, but they basically manipulated tobacco to make it more addictive. As he rightly said, Pringle, which is now owned by Procter & Gamble, studied away. You can't stop eating them. So basically, they advertise saying you can't stop eating them because they studied that. And my children, they only buy those products. Yes, correct. They did it on purpose. So if scientifically companies want to manipulate them, if you have the best psychologists ever and the best chemists ever to manipulate things, okay, I mean, you can do that, no problem. We can have some more remarks or questions. I'll follow up to what you were saying on regulation. In Europe, this is quite relevant. For example, think about what Draghi said at the Rimini meeting. One of the problems we have in Europe is that major companies, major champions are lacking. Hence, we need to grow big champions. But big companies, big champions also have take on a strong political rogue. Zingales wrote a lot of articles on that, showing that economic power corresponds to major political power. So much so that many big companies can self-regulate, can define regulations, and therefore it's difficult for the state to regulate them. Now, in Europe, we see that our market is regulated by the European Commission, which is a political body, but it is not elected directly, and therefore it is a technical entity deciding together with a very fragmented parliament, which doesn't have a clear majority. This system, I think, is less exposed to the capture of major groups. So let's think about the fines given to Google or Microsoft. So maybe we are just getting closer to the United States, or is there still some difference in our institutional setting whereby Europe is less exposed to the pressure of major political and economic groups? There are some differences. Not all differences are good. As in, it's true, we are very good at putting fines onto American companies, but let's talk about car companies. Volkswagen, for example, had cheated on emissions, air emissions, but the standard of European emissions are much higher because the German company did systematic lobbying to get to that. When Angela Merkel went to the United States, actually defended Volkswagen and did lobbying in the United States against those saying that Volkswagen was cheating. So we don't have to say that in Europe we're all saints and that things do not happen. They do happen also in Europe. Mechanisms are very different, that's true. For example, the national component is very important in Europe. Germany counts much more than other countries, and since the German industry is very important, and the German automotive industry is very important, then it is protected. They have no software companies in Germany. I mean, the software companies are not as big in Germany as in other countries. So we can have standards, which to some extent are even too much, that make it difficult to create local big companies in that sector. We are obsessed with privacy here, whereas in the end, there is no privacy at all, because there is a spy on us on a permanent basis. The only thing we don't have is the scientific advantages that there could be by systematically studying diseases. Today, thanks to the national health care in Italy, we have wonderful data on who is dying and why is dying. If we cross this data with the sources of emissions of different substances, something wonderful can be done. But this is blocked by privacy because we don't want to know in the end what is killing us. Professor Natale. I have one last remark on that, as in the role of information. It's a sort of a paradox. So when talking about social preferences, talking about investors, we think about benevolent investors, but this is not always the case, especially regardless of the identity of these investors. So how can we interpret the democratization of the role of companies? Maybe we also need to increase information that companies have to give to society. They need to clarify their objectives and the way they pursue these objectives. Yes, one of the advantages is to force the disclosure of information from inside to outside. One of our proposals is to create a ombudsman, a representative of small shareholders, sitting in the board with no right to vote, but with the right and duty to force shareholders to vote on topics that may have a major social impact. That would be an idea to make information public. And that would have an enormous impact in terms of regulation and in terms of discipline, because people in the end are ashamed of behaving badly. But if no one knows that, they continue to do so. Okay, thank you. Let me thank our speakers today, because I think that starting to talk about these topics, which are very complex, but as you said, are part and parcel of our life and do have an impact on the way we conceive ourselves, the society, the place we live, and the role we have is very important and is very decisive. And therefore, I think that we also have to talk about the complex issues, and we have to start somewhere. And I think that the meeting is the right place to start off this debate. So thank you very much. I have one last thing to say. You said that donation is the only free action, and the meeting lives off donations. You all know that. You can enter the meeting for free, but because there are many donations, so I remind you that each donation is just like a brick enabling us to continue building this place, building the meeting. So in the fair, you will find the Dona Ora desks with a red heart. and there you can donate whatever you want. I remind you that the foundation is from the third sector, so you can deduct your donations from your taxes. Thank you very much to Professor Zingales, Professor Colombo, and Professor Natale for this very wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for being here with us.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
Proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.